Welcome to Unscripted with Russo. For our podcast, we decided to explore the people behind the narratives. I'll introduce decision makers and influencers and find out the intimate story behind their rise to success. Hey everybody, welcome to Unscripted with Russo. We are so excited to have you here with us today. I'm being joined by Matt Tuerk. He is currently running for the mayor of Allentown, but I've known Matt for a long time in a few different capacities around the Lehigh Valley, most recently with the Lehigh Valley Economic Development Corp. So Matt, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely thrilled to be here. You and I have had so many great conversations over the years in so many different formats. I'm a huge podcast fan, so when I thought there would be an opportunity to get on Unscripted with Ashley Russo, I was like, that's me. I got to be on there.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you're here. And we really have, it's interesting. This is really our first Zoom conversation though. So we've met at many events, many actual business meetings, filming around the Valley, but it's nice to talk to you this way. I wish it was in person, but thanks for doing the Zoom thing.
Absolutely. The Zooms it's a great opportunity to get to see everybody's personality is a little bit expressed in their homes. So you get to see a little bit of people's houses. So I'm glad to see your furniture there. I like that fun light
behind you. I like that fun little lamp you've got hanging there.
I will not turn it on because if it turns on, it'll shoot the whole video. But,
right. If you're listening, you can't see it, but that means you should go over to YouTube and check it out. So Matt, let me ask you a question. You grew up in the Lehigh Valley, but then you did move to Colorado. Tell me a little bit about your childhood and what we need to know about you.
Sure. So it's actually, I grew up in East Stroudsburg. So I was born in Minnesink Hills in Monroe County. Like Minnesink Hills is like go to East Stroudsburg, then go down to Marshall's Creek, then go down to Minnesink Hills. Before you get to the river, then you find like our little hamlet. But I was born there and we spent time in Lehigh Valley. I can remember as a kid coming to Laneco to buy toys.
To the big city? You came to the big city for the Laneco, experience?
Well, compared to Stroudsburg, it was a big city. But we moved, so my parents actually dropped out of college each independently before my brother and I were born. And because we lived close to my grandparents, we actually lived on my grandparents' property. They had an opportunity to go back to East Stroudsburg University. They graduated at the same time and then took us to Colorado for grad school. So when I was 9, we got out of Pennsylvania. My brother was only 8. So I contend that there's something that happens between age 8 and 9 where you lock on to where you're from. And as soon as I graduated from high school in Boulder, I was like, get me out of here. I'm going back to Pennsylvania. So I moved back to Philly.
That is so interesting to me, but your brother did not feel the same way?
He's been in Colorado since 1984. He's still there.
Wow.
I always joke that, so I think in 3rd grade in Pennsylvania, they teach you how to spell Monongahela. And that particular skill is so useless outside of Pennsylvania that you have to come back here. You have to be here to use it.
You need a place that you can use that useless knowledge. So
absolutely.
So you came back. I love that. So it was interesting to me that you had this time, and often people will say that those middle school, high school years are so formative in their lives. What impact did Colorado have on you and your development that you've kind of maybe reflected upon at this point in your life?
It's funny because that time in my life was like I became a member of certain other communities in Colorado. So punk rock was really important to me in high school, and the people, the ethos that we had there, we were kind of DIY before anybody knew what it stood for. That formed my perspective. And although I had that kind of East Coast edge to me, being in Colorado and being in the independent Republic of Boulder, if you've ever been there, you'd know, it really gave me a more kind of progressive view on the world. So Boulder and the dominant ethos around the University of Colorado really helped me understand or gave me a framework for the world. And then being in a college town, I mean, one of the early things I did at LVDC was kind of contextualize Lehigh Valley compared to some other college towns. There's more college students in the Lehigh Valley than there are in like Ann Arbor, Michigan, or I think in Boulder. We're not considered a college town necessarily, but we kind of are. That college town life, growing up as a high school kid in a college town like that, really it opened up some really interesting experiences and helped make me who I am now.
It's funny you talk about the independent Republic of Boulder, and I have been to Boulder, and I have a sister actually who lives in Denver, and it is its own really strong community. But that lifestyle you speak about, I find that there are commonalities between people who have grown up in kind of this region but also other similar regions. So it's rural to an extent. We're in touch with nature a lot in the Lehigh Valley and the Poconos, but we are close to big cities. So it's this interesting hybrid almost of like a cosmopolitan experience, but with this beautiful nature influence, I guess is the way I always put it. And were there parts of your upbringing in Pennsylvania in a relatively small town that you have kind of migrated back to, or things that were near and dear? Like, what did you do as a kid? You think about 7-year-old Matt, like what was your go-to move? Were you wild and hyper? Were you a rule follower? Were you into sports?
We lived in a tiny town on the Delaware. We basically lived in the river. We were like river kids. So we had, there was a small group of us. We rode bicycles a lot. I think we were, it was a mix of Yankees fans and Phillies fans in 1980, 1981. So we collected baseball cards and we played baseball in the backyard. But we were terribly wild. It's funny, the kid who lived next door to me was born 2 days after I was. So our parents knew each other and he lived like literally next door to me. Our parents met each other in the hospital, but they knew each other going back to my mom grew up in the same house, and this kid's dad grew up in the same house. They knew each other in the 60s. So we all kind of knew each other. And the interesting thing has been to chart our divergent paths, right? So what he ended up doing with his life versus what I ended up doing with my life, he's on a different path. And had I stayed in East Stroudsburg, I very well could have been on that path. Now I am where I am, and I could not be happier. I'm really happy for having gone to Boulder, not least of which, most importantly, probably with Boulder, is that I met the woman who's now my wife in high school. So we weren't like high school sweethearts, but we met each other.
This is a very important fact and piece of your history. And, you always say like, well, if that hadn't happened, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. It's interesting. You get to the stage of life I think we're at, and you start to get that just enough that you could be reflective, right? Which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
You talked about your parents and moving you guys because of graduate school. And I know education was such a huge focus for your parents. Talk to me a little bit about them and what they did. And I guess kind of what you learned through watching their education journey. I think it's so interesting when parents complete or further their education while also raising kids, never mind being, I just think, awesome and hard and challenging, but what an interesting example to set.
Well, so I had my birth parents, right?
Okay.
And then I recently started joking, and no knock on my parents, but my brother and I were kind of like grad school orphans. So they moved us to Colorado, and then my dad entered a PhD program in molecular biology, and my mom entered a PhD program in psych. She ended up getting a master's there, but he was like he lived in his lab. And my mom was taking a lot of classes. She also worked part-time while in a PhD program. She worked as a waitress. We were really poor. Like, we were grad school poor. And with kids, it's different to be like, I went to grad school without kids. Being in grad school with kids, it's tricky. So we were kind of grad school orphans, but we were lucky enough that our next door neighbor was a woman who was later on in her JD program, who kind of adopted us, right? And she took us into her house. She's a single Black mom she was originally from Alabama, but her daughters became our sisters. So we had this kind of community that came together around the university, right? So it was everybody that you were around was in education, and you had the molecular biology and psych, and there were law students all over the place. It was just it was such a neat environment. Education, though, is like what they do now. And my parents they both actually now live in Eastern Kentucky. My dad is teaching after not having a great time at a biotech startup in Boulder. My mom has been a school psychologist. She started in Denver working in low-income schools there, and now she's working in low-income schools in Eastern Kentucky. What they taught us as a result of both their commitment to education was that it's just something you have to do. But then also what I'm really interested now in is what my mom does, where she's always given of herself, right? When you're working with low-income kids, and she particularly as a school psychologist is working with kids that have problems, and she's there to make their lives a little bit better, which has been something that I've carried through my life.
I always think it's amazing to reflect on the people that have played a role. And you're describing so many interesting people and experiences that I don't know that everyone can say that. It's a unique experience to have the people that filtered into your life at that time and watching what you watched your parents go through, but also being sensitive to the concept that maybe you weren't going to do the same thing when you went to grad school. So I think that that's interesting. Well, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to learn a little bit more about your personal journey, what happened after Colorado, college, career, and tell us a little bit more about stage 2 in Matt's life. So we'll be back with Unscripted in just a minute. As a mother of 2, I know it can be tough to find activities that everyone will enjoy. Luckily, the Lehigh Valley has so many ways to treat your family without breaking the bank. You can experience cool discoveries at the Da Vinci Science Center or all aboard the WKNS railroad train for an afternoon adventure. There's fun around every corner of the Lehigh Valley, and you can uncover it all on Discover Lehigh Valley's website. Visit discoverlehighvalley.com for more information. Welcome back to Unscripted. I am joined by my friend Matt Tuerk. Matt is here talking to us a little bit about his journey, which was this interesting eclectic upbringing, started up in the Poconos, moved to Colorado. Matt, you're talking about your parents being in grad school and kind of the idea that you had 2 moms and you had multiple people feeding your life experience. Tell us a little bit more about that and why was that helpful to you?
Well, I mean, so having one mom is fantastic, can be fantastic, can be tricky particularly when you're living life and you're getting a lot of advice from one mom. Having 2 moms, you get double the advice, so double the guidance, and always have somebody kind of keeping you on the straight path. So we have, after when I finished high school, I was committed to coming back to Pennsylvania. Like I wanted to get back to Pennsylvania, and I came out here, and it didn't click. Like I moved from Boulder. I had been working at a comic book store in high school, and somebody at a comic book store, this was in the 90s. This is like pre-internet, pre-email or whatever. So somebody at a comic book store in Boulder knew somebody at a record store in Philly and told me they could get me a job. And so I moved to Philadelphia, and I got there and they're like, who? And so I moved to Philadelphia. It's like, it's like, I wasn't necessarily like, although my parents were students, I went to an alternative high school. I worked in high school, again, following kind of the example of my mom, I worked through high school to pay my tuition. So I had a part-time, sometimes full-time job during high school because my parents couldn't pay my tuition. So I could pay my tuition so I could go to the school that I wanted to go to. But it didn't necessarily mean when I completed, I didn't necessarily see college as the next step. So I just moved to Philly. I was going to work in a record store. I was like, the punk rock guy.
Yeah, but whatever. It's an opportunity, something fun. I mean, who doesn't want to work in a record store?
Exactly.
After Pretty in Pink, didn't everyone want to work in a record store?
That wasn't necessarily my, I was more of a...
That would have been my reason though, Matt.
Well, the great thing is that I ended up finding a great comic book store to work at in Philly, but that was later on. But it kind of crashed out and I moved back to Boulder. And thankfully you move back to your family and they're like, okay, we're going to tolerate this for a little while, but then we're going to get you straight. My mom actually, she knew I wanted to be in Eastern Pennsylvania. She and my brother completed my college application to Rutgers Camden and filled it out and basically handed it to me and said, here, sign this. And I was like, I didn't even know what I was signing. I'm like 18 years old. And later in that, I guess in 94, my mom called me up and she said, hey, you can go to college if you want to. And this is again in the 90s. I was like, okay. Like I had nothing going on in Boulder. So I was like, I'll go do that. And I did. And it was, again, that like beginning that college experience was like, I really truly love learning. Like I love being in that environment. And it was fantastic. The career went on from there.
It's so important though to share that. And I just want to pause on that for a minute, because I know that I've heard from listeners and I've heard from people in our community that talk about, they really appreciate when people share that they didn't necessarily take the most straight and direct path. And there's so much pressure now. My kids are 16 and 18 years old, and there's this incredible amount of pressure for them to know exactly what they want to do with their life, exactly where they want to go to school. We kind of keep reminding ourselves the journey is kind of what makes life interesting. And I think your story speaks to that, this idea that you didn't really know college wasn't really necessary in the path. And then you end up at college and realize, oh my gosh, I actually really like learning.
But what's funny though, so I ended up, real like quick version is I was at Rutgers Camden. I was living in Camden, got to know Rutgers Camden is like a commuter school for South Jersey, but it's also like a lot of people who can't fit into the Rutgers system in North Jersey end up in Newark for whatever reason, or sorry, in Camden. So like I had all these crazy roommates from lots of different experiences who gave me like, again, that whole different perspective. So I was at Rutgers Camden for 2 years, ended up dropping out there because I didn't know what my major was going to be. Or not dropping out, but transferring to Temple because I was really like Philly oriented. And I had found a community in Philly that was kind of like the punk rock community. A lot of people who were at Temple. So I went to Temple and was doing film and media arts. I thought I was going to be a film critic. Like that's what I wanted to do. And I was there for all of a semester and a half and ended up dropping out, like really dropping out this time because it just wasn't clicking, right? And it's that thing. It's like, what's the journey? And I ended up, I dropped out so that I could remember the woman that I mentioned that I met in high school. I dropped out to go live with her in Bellingham, Washington, which is between Seattle and Vancouver. I just kind of like packed all my
like
stuff
packed
up
up,
and
you
moved.
go cross country. Okay.
Yep.
Which
and
a
got
lot
a
of people
job
would never consider doing that, but you wonder, was that big move that your parents made when you were 9 so formative that you thought like, hey, it's not that big of a deal to go do this. You give it a shot.
It was that part, but it was all, and that kind of like openness to adventure and the willingness to try anything was huge. And so I ended up working in a record store in Seattle. That was like finally the record store thing happened, right? But my wife she was in an undergrad program, and she was like on that straight path, right? Like she knew what she was going to do. She wanted to be a marine biologist. She did environmental science at Western Washington. And when she finished that program, she went to a marine science program at the College of Charleston. And I was like, okay, well, that's what we're doing now. So we went from Bellingham, Washington, all the way down to Charleston, basically to get away from the Pacific Northwest weather. We went to the sunniest thing we could find in Charleston. And then, again, this is like, what am I going to do now? Well, the college is here. It was not the most, colleges were cheaper in the mid 90s. I enrolled in college, took out some loans. And that now with all of that kind of life experience, kind of seeing things from lots of different perspectives, now I knew I was going to do international business. Like I was fascinated by the world. I hadn't really seen the world yet, but I knew that I was fascinated by other countries and other ways and other people's ways of doing things. And I was curious about business from that record store experience. And I did an international business program. I studied abroad. I was able to do a master or a majored in international business, did a minor in Spanish and a second minor in Latin American studies, and was able to study abroad in Cuba and then enter into an MBA program at the University of South Carolina, where I continued that study. I worked in Nicaragua as a result of that. So really, like, although it was on like a wayward path, I really consolidated it down and a lot of education into the end there, but still always with that eye toward like, okay, what are the crazy experiences that I can add in here? So studying in Cuba, I did like language immersion in Mexico, doing an internship in Managua, Nicaragua, where I was I had an apartment in the outskirts of Managua. I would ride a bicycle into the center of Managua every day to work for Bell South. It was an awesome experience, but it's like the openness to adventure, and wherever that came from, whether it came from my parents or punk rockers or whatever it was, I had it and I still have it.
It also speaks to seizing opportunity. I mean, I think that's a common theme that we hear, and people who have found success, however they define success, which certainly can be defined a lot of ways. A lot of it is around seizing opportunity, either seeing a need that maybe your skill set could fulfill, or finding something in yourself that an experience could fulfill. So I think it's that like ebb and flow. And you did so much of that, which is fascinating. And eventually you ended up back here. So how'd you get back into the Lehigh Valley and eventually into sort of this economic development role? Because I do want to make sure we get to our last segment. We have time to talk about what you're up to now, which is so exciting, but I want to understand how did all of that culminate into ending up back here?
So I had two choices coming out of grad school. One was like 100%. Well, the one that was like a 50-50 chance was working for a new urbanist developer in Charleston, building a new kind of something in North Charleston. That was like 50-50. There was a 100% chance that I had a job in Bangor, PA, working for a private equity owned billboard company that had its asset in Panama. My wife was 8 months pregnant. So I was like, I'm doing the 100% thing. Like that is what we're going to do. And it was, my grandparents were still alive and they were living in East Stroudsburg. And I thought, okay, I can be close to my grandparents toward the end of their lives. And when we came back here, it was like, okay, the job's in Bangor. I was a city guy. Bangor wasn't exactly, I love Bangor, but it wasn't like the city experience that I was looking for. So I was like, well, I'll try Allentown. And we bought a house here, completely loved it. I spent a lot of time in Panama in those first 4 years that I was here, but completely fell in love with Allentown, and then found this through like the weird quirks, right? It's all relationships and openness and who you're willing to talk to and seizing opportunities, but ended up meeting somebody who was looking for the assistant director position at the Allentown Economic Development Corporation. When I did that MBA program, I had focused on international economic development. So I was curious about development. International development's a little different, but I was curious. I was always a city guy, right? So when I had that opportunity to work here in Allentown, I jumped on it. And then it's just been a wild ride since then. We turned around AEDC. Scott Unger and I focused on urban manufacturing and in alternative workspaces. We built up the Bridgeworks Enterprise Center and got it back on its feet. Had a great few years there, lived through a tremendously interesting time in Allentown, and then was lucky enough to be in the room when Don Cunningham at LVDC was looking for someone to really dig in on the Lehigh Valley and be a good data person. And I had those research skills, and he recruited me to come over to LVEDC. I spent the first year or so there working on those kind of regional stats and trying to contextualize Lehigh Valley, and kind of moved up through the ranks at LVEDC, and ultimately was the VP of Economic Development and Marketing there, working to attract investment to the Lehigh Valley, trying to put Lehigh Valley on the map in the minds
I think
of
it's safe to say that you and Don and the team really did that. Like, you're watching, as our business got established and grew, we were watching that unfold kind of with a front row seat, when we have a camera rolling and the opportunity to work with you and the organization. It's amazing. I've lived here 16 years now, and to see what's happened, especially in the last decade, it's amazing how many more people know who we are. It's amazing how much industry has moved to this area, the growth that we've seen kind of in every sector, even through COVID, just to see the way the community has stepped up to support one another for the most part. That's been interesting, really, really been interesting. So what would you say is the best lesson that you learned in your time in that role in the Lehigh Valley and in Allentown?
Oh my gosh. If there was I don't know what the single lesson is. I'd say one of them is that it's easier to, when you have a great asset, when you have a great like core thing, it's easier to craft a narrative around that. So we did a great job at LVEDC. We also had a great community to work with, right? So when we are trying to put Lehigh Valley on the map, it's easy when there's great people and great economic assets that you're telling the story about. And really, like, this is such a cool and amazing and diverse place. Like, there's an infinite, you've had that more than anybody, you've seen that more than anybody else. There's like an infinite number of amazing stories here. Everywhere you turn.
I'll never forget when we started the Peak TV, and we're pushing, I think we're getting up to close to 200 episodes, and we feature like 5 or 6 stories every episode. People would say, you're going to do a show about the Lehigh Valley. I mean, how are there enough stories? Do you think there's enough content for that? And it was funny when we first started, of course, we're like, I don't know. I hope so. We know this, we know that, but it just rolled. And it was almost like we grew as the community grew, and the people came, and the stories came, and the development came. And it's just been interesting to watch. But you've now made a major shift. So you recently left the LVEDC and announced your bid for the mayor of Allentown. And I have to say, I was surprised, not because of any lack of faith in you. I think it's amazing and incredible. I just had known you in this one capacity. And now it's interesting hearing your background and hearing your desire to seize opportunity, to utilize your strengths. now I'm getting it. Now I'm sort of getting it. So I want to leave that as a little cliffhanger for our audience, because we are going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about this bid to be the mayor of Allentown and a little bit about your vision, as well as some of your favorite Lehigh Valley things. So we're going to ask everybody, stay tuned. You do not want to miss the rest of what we have to talk about with Matt Tuerk.
Home to the Iron Pigs in Dorney Park, Allentown is a city without limits. Food, art, dance, you name it, it's got it. Allentown's historic roots are matched with its vibrant culture to create an adventure that you'll never forget. Thinking of taking a trip? Follow Lehigh Valley PA on Instagram, and you'll find attractions, hotels, and sites you won't want to miss.
Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Unscripted with Russo. I'm being joined by Matt Tuerk, and right before the break, he was telling us a little bit about his time with the Lehigh Valley Economic Development Corp, his journey that took him there through his really interesting life, and of course, his record store, comic store adventures, which just makes me think of, the cool factor on you goes up even more, Matt, when I now know that you had this punk rock record store, comic book background. But here you are now, bidding to be the mayor of Allentown. So I have to ask, how did this come about for you? How was this something you'd always aspired to do? Was it out of the blue? Where does it come from?
I don't think it's something I always aspired to do. It was, so I didn't mention it yet. Although I grew up in Boulder, I was not, I played a lot of pickup basketball, but I wasn't an athletic kid. I think, but now I run a lot. Right. So I'm a marathon runner. I've run, I think 17 or 18. I've lost count of the number of marathons that I've run. But when you run, when you're training for marathons, you have a lot of time to yourself. And I don't listen to, although I love podcasts, I like to have time in my own head when I'm running. And running in Allentown, I get to see the whole city, and I get to think a lot about what I see for the city. So when I got the early start, it was in Ed Pulowski's first administration. And I got to know how Ed approached being the mayor of a city like Allentown. I tracked him and through his time over the years, and I saw ways that he did things well and things that he didn't do so well. And obviously there's a whole other story on that one. But then I watched Ray step in and really stabilize the city. What I always felt was that we could do better here, and which is not a knock in any way on Ray. I think Ray's been absolutely fantastic, and he did the job that the city needed at the time that it needed it. But now when I look at Allentown within the Lehigh Valley, I've witnessed Lehigh Valley really take off over the years. You have too. Absolutely. I always felt like Allentown could do a little better in that way.
Yeah,
there's so much amazing stuff here.
We look here for people maybe not necessarily from the Lehigh Valley. When we speak about the Lehigh Valley, we're really, of course, the footprint keeps expanding, but we're talking about that Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton, which are very unique cities with their own personalities, their own mayors, their own constituents, and they're just unique. And yet at the same time, we've been very regionalized, in large part because of our Chamber of Commerce, I believe, LVEDC. We've got this regionalization that's been happening for the last, 12, 15 years. And through that, even with all of the resurgence in Allentown and the rebuilding and what J.B. Riley and City Center have done, there is still just this definite, noticeable, I guess, I don't know what the right word is, but it's
so if you go back,
what is it going to be to get Allentown in that same?
One of the things you were talking about, it's interesting. So I tried to put Lehigh Valley into a frame that people could understand, right? And how amazing it was here. So we talked about the number. One of the early things I did was I talked about the size of the economy vis-a-vis other economies that people might appreciate. So our regional economy is bigger than that of the state of Wyoming and the state of Vermont. I think there has been a tendency in the Lehigh Valley to downplay the significance of a place. The reality is that Allentown's the third largest city in Pennsylvania. Lehigh Valley is the third largest metro in Pennsylvania. We're legit.
We're a presence.
We're big enough to matter.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're small enough that you can actually wrap your arms around it, right? This is a place where you can know people, and you can get involved, and you can be involved, and you can make change. So I really look at Allentown is just waiting to kind of burst out of its shell in the same way that the Lehigh Valley has, right? Lehigh Valley, and it was more me seeing it as I traveled. We were telling the story, and we're kind of helping people understand what this amazing jewel is here. But it was also just kind of like, this was a great thing. It was a diamond in the rough. It was it was kind of the best kept secret. Like, this is known outside. And I think that Allentown here within the Lehigh Valley, like, there's amazing stuff here that people might just not be aware of. I think that's where we're at, is that we need energetic leadership that will be somebody who will be a strong ambassador for Allentown, not just like across the country, but here in the Lehigh Valley too. Like, I love this place. I really love Allentown.
I really love it too. I love the Lehigh Valley, and I love the individual cities, the individual towns, seeing where we're going. And I love hearing your enthusiasm and your passion specifically for Allentown. So just give us a little bit about your vision. Like,
Sure.
we're not a political show, and we know that this is campaigns or campaigns and all that stuff, but learning a little bit about more who you are has been awesome. And I think hearing your vision would be really helpful to people, and paint us a picture.
So it really stems from, like, the first thing for me is that we are, and I really emphasize that word we, like, we are better together, right? When we're all collaborating. This is something that I picked up on the regional level, working with LVEDC, working with the chamber and the workforce board and these regional organizations, is that when we all collaborate, when we work through partners, when we engage partners, we do a lot better. So my vision in Allentown is an Allentown that is well integrated into the region. It's not trying to tell its own story or go it alone, or we're going to bunker down and figure it all out by ourselves. It's working with Bethlehem. It's working with Whitehall and Macungie, with Lehigh County, with Northampton County, having a collaborative approach to empowering the people here, right? So Allentown has amazing people who, for a long time, and probably longer than I've been here, have never really been tasked or asked to step up and really embody the change that they want to see here, right? So to me, that's a big piece of it. Another piece is to go back to the ambassador. Like, we need energy, enthusiasm. I'm a decaf drinker, I'll admit to that. But I have for the amount of energy that I have, I'm a marathon runner.
I was going to say, you're running marathons and you don't drink coffee? Come on, Matt. That's not fair.
I drink decaf. So those it's getting, but it's also reaching out and making sure that we have equitable economic development in Allentown. Because this is, what you see in the Lehigh Valley, you see in Allentown a little bit too. It's the south side, it's the east side, it's the west end, it's the wards. But we are a city, and we need to make sure that all of Allentown is included and has a seat at the table. And it doesn't just mean geographically, it means demographically as well. So if you look back to 1970 census, Allentown was like 98% white. Now in 2020, it's 55% Latino, 15% Black African American. Like, this is a really diverse city now, which I just absolutely love. But we have to make sure that everybody has a voice here, and not just that voice is heard. And this is what I've learned as a parent: not just heard, but listened to, and more importantly than listened to, understood. And then the last piece for me is really bringing that kind of the business sense to City Hall. So really looking and seeing how we can be more efficient in operations, doing the basic nuts and bolts. The one thing that people really want out of their city is they want the streets plowed when there's snow. They want trash picked up. They want to make sure that the police and fire show up when they need them. Basic city services are needed here to have a safe, clean, and healthy city. So really my approach is covering the whole city, bringing energy to this thing, working with partners. That I think that level of leadership.
I love it. I think that's hopefully so tied to the mission of the Peak TV and ASR Media, and so much of what's been important to me in my journey and my team's journey in the Lehigh Valley. But the thing that really resonates for me, all of that resonates for me, but the piece is that equitable piece and giving people not only a seat at the table, but a real conversations around change, and then brainstorming solutions. Being solutions focused in a collaborative way is the way I try to approach my businesses. And that concept that we all have something we can contribute. You may go with one person's idea over another, but if we don't at least get to the table and talk about it, we're really missing out. And we're missing out on, I love you said something about like kind of the inside out, like the people on the inside, the people live in Allentown, right? It's a diverse community. They need to be a part of the conversation, the collaboration, and the change. So I'm excited. I'm excited on that. That's great.
The other thing that I would add to that is that so it's forward focused, right? We're not going to go back to any old era of Allentown. Like Allentown is a city for the future. And this is the city, like we need to be modern here. We're going to keep moving in this really cool direction and continuing to get more and more diverse and more interesting. That trajectory is a trajectory that I want to continue here without a doubt.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that with us, and we certainly wish you the best of luck and know that you are a wonderful option for the city of Allentown, and I love what you're espousing to. So it's certainly something for all of us to be aware of and to be paying attention and listening. But before I let you go, you had mentioned in the segment 2 how much you love the Lehigh Valley and how much you love Allentown. So I want to ask you a little bit about some of your favorite things. Why do you live here, and kind of what's your favorite thing to do in Allentown and why?
So right now, one of the things that I'm doing in my campaign is I'm a marathon runner, so I run a lot. I'm running like 25 miles a week. I saw something that there's 423 miles of streets in Allentown. So I'm running between now and the primary. I'm running every street in Allentown. So my favorite thing to do.
Incredible. How are you tracking it? I mean, is there a little map of the?
So if you go to the mapformayor.org page, there's a Run Every Street tab there, and you can see the map where I'm recording all the progress.
I'm going to follow along with that. I love that. What a smart idea. Okay, so right now running through the streets of Allentown is your favorite activity. What about, and I'm going to broaden this to the whole Lehigh Valley, but what's your favorite restaurant? Do you have one place that you love or a few that you love?
I'm going to narrow it down to Allentown. I've got lots of there. What I'd say to the world is that you can come to Lehigh Valley and find just like off the charts amazing stuff. And this is, I'm not messing around. I was in Charleston. Charleston is like a food mecca, right? There's like world-class James Beard award-winning chefs in Charleston. So this isn't coming from like just somebody who hasn't had the perspective. There's awesome food in the Lehigh Valley. I have 2 favorites here in Allentown. One, and they happen to be around the corner from places where I lived. When we first moved to 11th and Linden, we had young kids. We ate 2 or 3 times a week at La Placita, Mexico, which is George and Anna, who are from Puebla, who have like the best tacos in the Lehigh Valley. That's our go-to still.
Haven't been there, so I'm going to add it to my list.
Number 2 for me though, now we live at 16th and Walnut, is Union and Finch. I've known Ed and Shanaz since way back. I was there kind of fighting with the community groups when Union and Finch was trying to open up in the old O'Malley's. I was trying to tell them like, look, this is different. This is not the thing that you thought with the old O'Malley's. And Union and Finch has been so awesome to us. It's got like Ed's vision is so thoroughly articulated in that restaurant, in the menu. And he's so pro Allentown. The food's awesome. And he has been dedicated with all this stupid pandemic. Ed has been sticking it out and doing great things for his employees and for his clientele. That's one of my favorite places in the Lehigh Valley. But I could go on. We could do a whole other podcast on restaurants that I love in Allentown and Lehigh Valley.
All right, good. Well, I know you love it here. If you were to give somebody from the outside, someone who has never been here before, what is something you would recommend that they come here and do? What's an activity, when people from out of town or you travel, what do you tell them is something really unique about our area?
So I used to joke when I was working at LBDC on like ways that we could do like regional taglines or regional stories. And I'd say like, okay, there's this place and it is full of senior citizens that are haggling over discount food on a Saturday at 4 p.m. And it's undercover and it's just, you can get like food from all over the place, but it's just like the most amazing thing. Most people will be like, yeah, that doesn't sound that interesting. But when you go to the Fairgrounds Farmers Market it's just the best. It's a place where you can actually like see people from all walks of life in Allentown. Like I grew up in Boulder on the Pearl Street Mall, and we would just sit and watch people. Like we were people watchers early on. Like to be in the fairgrounds and just like see what's happening, that you've got to go, because you get like a core sense of what Lehigh Valley is all about.
Yeah, well, people mention all the time, like, oh, have you gone to the famous market in Philly or New York or whatever? And I'm like, it's got nothing on the fairgrounds market in Allentown. You go in there and you think you're going to see a few shops, and like it's this treasure trove. You just keep going and going, and it's really absolutely incredible how many vendors are there. And of course, then we're supporting local, which is really always important and exciting. So I love that. That is a great answer. All right, well, the very last thing I'm going to do, Matt, here is we're going to go through our quick rapid fire. Are you ready? You have not heard these questions, correct?
I have no idea what's coming.
All right, here we go. What is one food you cannot live without?
Crab po' boy from Union Finch.
If you won the lottery, what's the very first thing you would do?
Oh my God. The first thing I would do is, I'm not a materialism guy. Like money, I don't know what I would do with money. I'd probably contribute most of it to my favorite charities in Allentown.
Yeah.
Second Harvest, 6th Street Shelter, the CACLV family of nonprofits.
Good answer. All right. If an actor was cast to play you in a movie about your life, what actor would be cast as you?
I'm answering for my wife, who, and my kids might get this too. Jason Schwartzman from Rushmore is like the look for me. If you got the nose, does it?
I was going to give you a Nicolas Cage, but okay, I'll go with it. All right. If you didn't have the job you have now, what would you be doing instead? And you have had a lot of eclectic jobs. So what would be?
I have two answers. So one of my dream jobs is, the simpler one is fishmonger. I love fish, and I love like helping people out. Like I dream for the job at the Wegmans fish counter. But the one that I really, really want, and it was funny, my dad and I were talking a couple months ago, and we didn't rehearse this, but it turned out we both have the same dream job. I would love to be a mail carrier, a mailman, like walking in neighborhood. I love to walk.
Well, first of all, I think you'd be running. I think you'd be a running mailman. That's one.
But just like walking in neighborhoods and getting to know people, like I love neighborhoods and I love people, and the getting to like being paid to walk around and knock on people's doors. That sounds awesome.
I love it. Well, Matt Tuerk, thank you so much for joining us. You are inspiring me to think about maybe a new show similar to an Undercover Boss, but maybe where you get to try your dream job. So maybe you could be a mail carrier for a week.
That'd be awesome.
And maybe you could work at the Allentown Fairgrounds at the Fish Mart.
Heckenbergers, yeah, that'd be cool.
I feel like this has reality TV potential. So thanks for joining us. We wish you the best of luck in your bid for the mayor of Allentown. We appreciate all that you do for our community, and thanks for being a good friend to me and to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening, everybody. This is Unscripted with Russo.